Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Now let us begin with Story 1, The Bedchamber of the Baron, Fire, Fur, and Feudal Knights. You find yourself stepping through the heavy oaken doors of a 13th century stone castle. The sun has set long ago. Flickering torchlight clings to the walls like nervous shadows. You are now in the world of the medieval knight, not in a bloody battlefield or a dramatic court intrigue, but in a place more quietly grueling, the Baron's bedchamber. It is late, the fire is low, and despite the thick walls, the wind makes itself known. The architecture of cold. Castles were built for defense, not comfort. Massive stone walls, often several feet thick, retained the cold like a grave. In the winter, the air inside these walls could be colder than outside. There were no insulation materials, no double glazing on the tiny arrow-slit windows, no rugs thick enough to mute the howl of the wind that funneled through every crevice. The bedchamber of a minor baron, positioned high in the keep for security, was a cold sanctuary. He had elevation for defense but paid the price in exposure. Wind crept through poorly fitted shutters. Stone floors stayed icy, no matter how many rushes you scattered or how tightly you stitched the tapestries to the walls. Those tapestries, by the way, were less for decoration and more a desperate measure to hold warmth. The great bed and all its layers. In the center of the room stood the baron's most prized possession, the bed. Four-poster, carved oak, taller than most men. It was raised off the floor not for vanity, but for practical reasons. The higher up you slept, the warmer it might be, slightly removed from the cold draft that hugged the ground. The bed was layered, straw mattress below, then a feather bed if he could afford it. Blankets of wool, not soft or supple but thick and scratchy. Above all of this were furs, bear, wolf, fox thrown on top with little regard for aesthetics. At night, servants might warm the sheets with bed warmers, metal pans filled with hot coals, but this had its risks. A moment too long and the straw stuffing might smolder. A moment too brief and the sheets remained icy. Timing was survival. Lighting the night. A single candle in an iron sconce offered the illusion of warmth. More candles would be extravagant. Wax was precious. Tallow, made from animal fat, was more common but stank terribly. It also smoked and spluttered, filling the air with a greasy film that clung to skin and fur alike. The smell mixed with human sweat, smoke, and damp stone. The baron may have had a fireplace, but it was poorly constructed by modern standards. Most heat went straight up the chimney. You could sit right in front of it and still feel your fingers grow numb. A matter of smell. The chamber had not been aired in weeks. Windows were closed tight, and the wind that managed to find its way in was unwelcome. The air was stale, a combination of wool, smoke, unwashed bodies, chamber pots, and cured leather. Bathing was infrequent. Washing sheets was dangerous. In winter, laundry froze before it dried, so most people simply didn't wash them. The result? A smell that permeated every surface. But to the medieval nose, trained by a lifetime of the same, this was the scent of normalcy. Who slept there? The baron did not always sleep alone. His wife, if he had one, would have her own smaller bed nearby or might share his. Servants might sleep on the floor, rolled in rough blankets. Children might join if they were sick, scared, or favored. The bedchamber was less a private space and more a semi-public, shared one. Privacy was a modern luxury. Proximity meant warmth. The heavy curtains around the bed weren't just for romance, they were to trap heat. Some bed frames even had enclosed tops and sides, like a wooden box. Crawl in, close the curtains, and hope you didn't wake up with frozen fingers. Sounds of the night. Outside the shutters the castle moaned. Wind curled around towers and whistled through battlements. Dogs barked in the outer courtyard. Owls hooted. Somewhere far off, a sentry's footsteps echoed along the wall walk. Inside it was rarely silent. The fire snapped, people coughed, someone snored. Rats scurried in the rafters. The stone ceiling amplified every sound. Strange rituals for warmth. A hot brick wrapped in cloth might be placed at the foot of the bed. Some believed that rubbing goose fat on the feet kept them warmer. An oily, sticky ritual passed through generations. A warm ale might be sipped slowly, its steam curling like incense in the frigid air. Some barons believed in sleeping in shifts, rising at midnight to pace the chamber or pray. Not for piety, but to prevent their blood from freezing still in their veins, or so they feared. Securing the night. The heavy wooden door was bolted from the inside. Despite all the defenses outside the drawbridge, the portcullis, the guards, the baron knew that security began at the door to his chamber. He trusted few. Daggers had been drawn in such places before. His sword rested within reach, though he hadn't drawn it in months. Still, it was tradition. Just as the fire was banked carefully and the dog allowed to curl at the foot of the bed, so too was the blade kept close. It was as much part of bedtime ritual as prayer. A life lived in cold. Night after night, year after year, this was how a baron wealthy by medieval standards survived the night. And if his conditions seem harsh, imagine those of the people below him. He was the fortunate one, sleeping above ground, wrapped in furs beside a flame. This world of stone and frost, of ritual and silence, shaped generations. It dictated how children were raised, how families grew, and how power was preserved. But even within this fortress of cold and isolation, one wonders. Did the baron truly sleep peacefully, or did the castle itself breathe and shift through the night, whispering old feudal secrets into his dreams? The candle gutters in the wall sconce. The fire's glow dies down into a slow, pulsing ember red like a distant eye. It's the middle hours now. You may think of them as midnight, but to the baron, and to all within his keep, this hour is known only by its weight, a silence broken not by peace, but by the low, aching tension that lingers before the cock crows. Let us now descend deeper into the unseen nighttime patterns of the medieval noble. This is not the battlefield, nor the hall of feasts. This is the bed, the breath, the bones that ache when lying still too long on straw. The pattern of two sleeps. In medieval times, night was not slept in one uninterrupted stretch. Sleep came in two halves, the first sleep and the second sleep, separated by a quiet wakefulness. The baron's first sleep would begin shortly after sundown, especially in winter, when darkness claimed the sky before dinner was digested. He would sleep for a few hours, wake around midnight, and spend an hour or two in a liminal state, neither fully alert nor fully at rest. This period of wakefulness was not abnormal. It was expected, even valued. The baron might use this time for prayer, reading a religious passage by the low light of a taper, or speaking softly with his wife or servant. In winter, it was perhaps the only time the castle felt truly still. But more often than not, this hour brought reflection and sometimes dread. Insomnia or penance. Anxieties loomed heavier in the dark. The affairs of the manor, poor harvests, disloyal vassals, the looming visit of a tax collector were burdens even a featherbed couldn't soften. Dreams of plague, of dying children, of frostbite or famine slipped into waking thought. Some barons took this time to pace the bedchamber barefoot on cold stone, a small act of penance meant to draw them nearer to God. Others simply could not sit still. Their body clock, shaped by decades of broken nights, compelled them to rise and move. The candle stub lit once more, but for just a few minutes too expensive to waste. It wasn't darkness that scared them. It was what their thoughts did when the body stilled. The castle stirs. In some keeps, midnight marked a soft stirring of movement. A servant might quietly feed the fire. The chaplain, if nearby, could be found at a small altar. A guard might knock softly to report a change of shift or the passing of a message from the tower. The castle never fully slept. Not entirely. In every hour of darkness, someone was walking the wall, checking the gate, moving through the shadows with practiced care. Even the rats, emboldened by stillness, would begin their scurry across rafters, chewing what scraps they could from stored goods or boots left by the bed. The night draught. If the Baron was lucky, or of a region fond of such habits, he might enjoy a night draught, a small cup of warmed wine or ale laced with herbs. Valerian for sleep, hops for peace, mugwort perhaps if he leaned toward the superstitious. Sometimes these drinks were fortified with honey and aged vinegar, brewed slowly over a kitchen fire. This concoction wasn't just for indulgence, it was medicine, a ritual, a moment of comfort amid cold stone. The warmth would spread through his chest slowly, like a second fire. It didn't erase the frost, but it gave the illusion of control over the night. The weight of duty, even in sleep. Feudal lords like our Baron bore responsibilities that extended well beyond daytime. His people depended on him not just to govern, but to be a symbol of continuity. He could not afford to fall ill, to appear weak, or to abandon routine. Even at night, duty persisted. Messages arrived at odd hours, brought by damp riders from nearby villages, requests for grain or warnings of bandits. If news of conflict stirred, the Baron might be woken and forced into hurried decision-making before his second sleep began. His sword, always at the bedside, was a reminder that even here in the warmth of fur and fire, violence was never far. It was not paranoia. It was preparation. Clothing for sleep, a cold balance. The Baron did not sleep nude. That would have been foolish in such a climate. Instead, he wore a linen shift, sometimes wool, though it could be scratchy, and a nightcap tied securely around the chin to protect the ears from freezing. In colder months, woolen hose might remain on the legs or be tucked beneath the bedclothes to warm up before morning. Leather or woolen gloves were rare but used by the particularly cautious or sickly. The idea was not to layer endlessly, but to trap what warmth the body naturally emitted. Too many clothes and one risked sweating then freezing. It was a delicate dance with death, practiced nightly. Dreams in the cold. It is difficult to imagine the Baron dreaming of luxury. More likely, he dreamt of missed harvests, of his hounds lost in the woods, of icy rivers and starved tenants. Even his dreams carried the weight of responsibility. The cold did not retreat when the eyes closed. Dreams in medieval times were taken seriously. A bad dream might mean divine displeasure or worse, sorcery. If he dreamt of drowning, of darkness, of failing walls, he would speak to his chaplain in the morning, or perhaps not. Some dreams were best left unspoken, especially those that included figures long dead. Nightmares and night terrors. The belief in night terrors, succubi, incubi, or the dreaded nightmare, an evil spirit that sat on your chest and stole your breath, was common. The Baron, though educated for his time, may have held such fears close. Charms hung near the bedpost, iron knives tucked beneath pillows, psalms whispered under breath, a small cross sewn into the lining of the bed curtain. When you cannot control the cold and cannot control the dark, you try to control the symbols. The line between fear and faith was not sharply drawn. The midnight necessity. No discussion of the Baron's night would be complete without the chamber pot. Crude, made of pewter or ceramic and often shared. There was no plumbing in these heights of the keep. If urgent, a servant might be called to empty it. If not, it remained until morning, its contents slowly chilling in the corner. The odor mixed with the other thousand smells of stone living. It was unpleasant, but normalized. The fire's last breath. In the final hour before second sleep, the fire was checked. Its coals would be turned and banked, covered lightly with ash to retain heat. If left alone too long, it would die and take with it any hope of a warm waking. Servants understood the fire's rhythm better than their own. They fed it like a child, cradled its ember heart, prayed it would last. A fire that lasted the night was a blessing. One that did not was a punishment. No one wanted to be the one to admit it had gone cold. Prayer before the return to sleep. Second sleep began with prayer, usually short, sometimes mumbled, for health, for safety, for warmth. Not all of it was in Latin. Often it was instinct, routine, a whisper to the ceiling or to a god who, in the moment, felt very far away. The castle creaked again. The Baron adjusted his nightcap, pulled the furs tighter, and turned on his side. Outside, the wind began to rise once more, crawling over the battlements like a burglar. The guard yawned at his post. Somewhere in the east, the sky hinted at a change in light, though it would be hours yet before dawn. But as the Baron drifts toward second sleep, tucked deep beneath wool and fur, one wonders. Was survival truly in the warmth of blankets, or in the thousand tiny rituals that gave meaning to a night without end? The Baron stirs again, not from dream but from habit. Second sleep is ending now. The outer edge of the sky is faintly gray, though it offers no warmth. His breath fogs in the cold morning air, a soft reminder that the stone walls have not grown any kinder overnight. Morning in a medieval keep is not triumphant. It is not heroic. It is cold, cautious, and slow to begin. For the Baron, waking means more than opening his eyes. It means resuming a quiet war against his environment, his duties, and the creeping chill that never truly left his bones. Now we arrive at the final hours of this long, sleepless history, where night transitions into burden once more. The first senses. The first thing the Baron feels is the weight of the bedclothes. Wool, fur, linen. They press against him like a second body. He lingers beneath them not out of laziness but survival. The air beyond is bitter. Each exposed inch of skin feels like it is being claimed by winter's breath. He listens before moving, to the creak of timbers, to the muffled movement in the great hall below. A servant stirs the ashes. Hooves echo faintly from the stable yard. A rooster calls, confused perhaps in the pre-dawn fog. The Baron does not spring from bed. He moves deliberately, carefully, like a man who knows the price of cold floors on aging joints. Morning ablutions without water. There is no basin of steaming water waiting for him. At best, a servant has filled a shallow bowl with water drawn late last night and left it to sit inside the chamber so it would not freeze completely. Still, it is icy, unpleasant, and a poor substitute for what we might call bathing. He splashes it onto his face and neck with stiff fingers. A cloth is used to wipe beneath arms, between toes, never fully clean, just less unclean than before. Soap is rare and pungent, used sparingly. More often, light ash or rough cloth suffices. Teeth are left alone or rubbed with salt. Breath is masked with herbs chewed dry, mint, sage, or sometimes parsley. None do much to hide the deeper scent of an unwashed mouth, but they are rituals nonetheless. Dressing for the day. Dressing is not a private matter. The Baron's clothing is layered, intricate, and designed for function before flair. A servant, typically male, trusted, and long-serving, assists. First come the linen undergarments, clean if they're lucky, then the woolen shows for the legs, a padded tunic, then a surcoat or fur-lined mantle, the belt, the pouch, the keys, a dagger tucked into his boot. The layers are protection not just from cold, but from perception. A Baron must appear composed even in his own hall. Wrinkled sleeves or mismatched hose might be seen as signs of illness or madness. His hat or coif is pulled tight. His gloves are warmed near the hearth, then handed over. Dressing is slow. Everything about the morning is slow, because it must be. Haste in this cold only leads to mistakes. Reviving the fire. The fire, if not carefully banked, has died. If it survived, the ember is gently stirred to life. Twigs and bark are added, then logs. A servant kneels, blowing steadily. If no smoke rises, a flint is struck. This ritual has meaning beyond comfort. It marks the transition of the space from a sleeping chamber back into a room of command. The fire is not just heat, it is light, movement, life. Its revival signals that the Baron is once again present, awake, watching. The morning meal, sparse, strategic. Breakfast is not grand, not yet. A small meal is brought to the chamber, coarse bread, cheese if the stores allow, perhaps a cold slice of yesterday's roasted meat, a boiled egg if it can be spared. Ale is served not for pleasure but because the water is suspect, weak, warm, flat, and far safer than the alternative. There is no fork. He eats with fingers or a small knife, wiping grease on a cloth or the edge of the table. Talking is minimal. No one seeks conversation before the sun fully breaks. The Baron may eat alone or in the company of a steward or chaplain. If they speak, it is of taxes, land disputes, or news from the road. There is no idle gossip at this hour, only updates, problems, schedules. The meal is short. Warmth fades quickly from the bread, and the chamber remains cold despite the fire. The responsibilities await. By now, the outer walls echo with life. Footsteps of soldiers on patrol, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the distant bleat of sheep being herded toward frost-bitten pastures. The Baron must soon descend to his hall where others will await him. Tenants with grievances, messengers with scrolls, family members with needs. Every day is filled with decisions, many of them tedious. How much grain to reserve, whether to permit hunting in certain woods, who must be punished for theft. The night offered stillness, now duty resumes. But first there are prayers. Morning prayer and the castle's rhythm. A quick stop at the family chapel or prayer niche. Not for public display, those will come later. This is personal. A candle is lit, a wooden bead pressed between fingers. Thanksgiving for warmth, for survival through the night, for another dawn. Even a baron does not take these for granted. Across Europe, this rhythm plays out daily. Lords and ladies, knights and nuns, peasants and priests all turn to the eastern light with a sigh of acceptance. Today will be cold, it will be long, but it has come, and so it must be met. The servants who make it possible. None of this would function without the quiet hands who prepare it. The servants who slip into the chamber before sunrise, who light the fire, mend the tunic, refill the candle, pour the ale. Most are silent. They have learned that invisibility is safety. The Baron may not know all their names, but he relies on them all. The boy who carries the coals, the woman who spins new linen, the steward who memorizes the accounts, even the dog who sleeps near the door and rises when the Baron stirs. This silent network of labor keeps the illusion of nobility intact. Without it, the cold would consume him. The day begins. And so he opens the chamber door. The hallway greets him with a colder breath than even his chamber could muster. But he steps forward, cloak trailing behind, breath clouding the air. The great hall is already being swept, the high table set, murmurs fall silent as he enters. He is not a king, he is not a saint. He is a man with a title in a castle that barely holds back the dark. But to those who live beneath his roof, he is protection, order, continuity. And to uphold that illusion, he must never seem tired, never too cold, never uncertain. The bedchamber waits. The chamber, now empty, will cool once more. The bed will be remade, the pot emptied, the fire left to smolder. It waits for the return of the Baron hours from now when night comes again. No one speaks of it, but the chamber is as much a part of governance as the hall or the court. For it is here that decisions are considered, that bodies rest, and that resilience is forged not in grand acts but in simply surviving the night. Reflection. As we close this first story, it is not the grandeur of medieval life that lingers, it is the quiet struggle. The slow waking from a cold bed, the rituals of survival woven into every gesture, the unspoken alliance between fire and flesh, silence and sleep. The Baron, for all his wealth, was a prisoner of the night just like the rest of us. He wrapped himself in fur and prayer, trusting in old stones to hold back the wind. And as he stepped into the duties of another day, one might wonder, were the coldest battles fought with swords or in the darkness between sleep and dawn, where no one could see the weight he carried? Story 2, Servants Beneath the Floor, How the Lower Quarters Survived the Cold. When you imagine a medieval castle, your mind likely climbs upward toward the battlements, the Lord's Chamber, the great hall filled with echoing voices. But below the polished floors, beneath the weight of stone and ceremony, lay another world. This was the world of the castle's servants, cooks, laundresses, stewards, pages, spit boys, and countless others whose names never entered the scrolls of history. They were the ones who made the warmth of noble life possible, even as they slept in its coldest shadows. And while their stories rarely appear in the grand narratives, it was here, underfoot, that the real rhythms of medieval survival quietly pulsed through the night. The lower quarters, not dungeons but not warm. The servant spaces of medieval castles were rarely as fortified or as warm as the living chambers above. Most of these quarters were tucked into the cellars, kitchens, and unused storage rooms near the base of the keep, or in auxiliary buildings near the curtain walls. Here stone was more than architecture, it was air. The walls sweated in winter, damp from poor drainage and condensation. Ceilings were low, light was minimal, and airflow was poor. In some keeps, these areas were windowless, with only slatted wooden vents to allow the musty air to circulate. Fires were strictly controlled and allowed only in designated hearths. An unauthorized flame meant punishment and possible death by smoke or fire, which meant most servants simply endured. Sleeping arrangements, hard, shared, and temporary. There were no private rooms. Servants slept where they could, beside kitchens, under stairs, in storage lofts, or curled against barrels in cellars. Some had straw pallets rolled in corners. Others used simple wooden boards or crates with nothing but a coarse woolen blanket between their body and the air. It was not uncommon for 3 or 4 people to share a single pallet, lying side by side, turned like fish in a pan. Body heat was precious. Intimacy was less a matter of romance than thermodynamics. Their sleep was never guaranteed. Loud footsteps above, a barking dog, or the sudden need to stoke the oven or attend to a crying noble child could end rest before it ever truly began. Clothes for sleeping, the same as for working. Most servants slept in the same clothes they worked in. There was little choice. They couldn't afford spare garments, and undressing in the cold was unthinkable. Woolen tunics, leather belts, sometimes hose if they were lucky. Layers weren't changed, they were accumulated. Each new garment added another thin line of defense against the night's bite. Washing those clothes was a rare luxury. Cold nights turned damp wool into a clammy second skin, but sweat had no odor in a place where no one could afford perfume. Sleeping near the hearth if you were lucky. Those assigned to the kitchens or bakery were the most fortunate if their master allowed them to sleep nearby. These rooms, filled with slow fires and warm stones, were the only places that offered sustained heat through the night. But even here there were dangers. Sleeping too close meant risking burns, sparks, or smoke inhalation. The ovens were temperamental, and a collapsed chimney could mean sudden death. Still, many curled up beside the hearth, tucking their cloaks beneath them and lying as close to the coals as they dared. The dull glow was a comfort. It was warmth, and warmth was life. The laundress's corner. Among the coldest of the lower quarters was the corner assigned to laundry servants. Often situated near water sources, these areas were damp year-round. In winter, water froze in buckets, and cloth froze stiff if not wrung and hung fast enough. The laundresses, often women of low birth or widows taken into service, slept with their hands raw and red. Their fingers cracked from soap and lye, their nails broken. Their bedding was often whatever hadn't yet dried on the line, wrapped around them as makeshift blankets. To sleep meant curling beneath the very garments they'd washed. In summer, it was tolerable. In winter, it was agony. Spit boys and kitchen sleep. The youngest of the kitchen staff, often orphan boys or the children of indebted families, were tasked with turning the spits. For hours, they would sit beside the fire, slowly rotating heavy iron rods over the flames, their faces scorched and backs chilled. When their task was done, they would crawl into corners and sleep upright, too sore to lie down properly. The heat never lasted. The fire went out before morning and the chill returned. Still, their position near the kitchen meant they sometimes received scraps, bones with shreds of meat, stale bread dipped in fat, a prize in the cold world of the lower quarters. Personal belongings kept close and hidden. There were no chests, no wardrobes. A servant's entire possessions fit in a bundle or sack tucked beneath their head at night. A spare tunic if they had one, a wooden comb, a bit of twine, maybe a religious token carved from bone. These belongings were private in a world with no privacy. Theft was common, and disputes over even a crust of bread could lead to exile or worse. So every bundle was watched, every scrap mattered. And when sleep came, it was with one arm across the sack, even in dreams. Prayers without chapels. Servants didn't have the luxury of chapels or morning mass, but that didn't mean they didn't pray. A scrap of scripture memorized from a priest's sermon, a whispered plea to a forgotten saint, a token cross drawn in the dirt beside the pallet. Prayer wasn't always pious. Sometimes it was practical. Please let the fire last. Please let the stew not burn. Please let my fingers not freeze. Please let the steward be in a good mood. These were the midnight devotions of the working poor, earnest, unadorned, and never recorded. The sounds of below. Night in the servant quarters was rarely quiet. Pipes groaned, wood creaked. Mice and rats scurried across shelves, gnawed through sacks. Someone coughed, someone snored, someone murmured in sleep. Above them, the noble household moved faintly. Footsteps on flagstones, a door hinge squealing, distant laughter or an argument muffled by a thick stone ceiling. Sometimes the sounds from above were comforting, proof that the castle still lived. Other times, they reminded the servant that they were always being listened for but never listened to. Rats, bugs, and bitten sleep. Rats were constant companions. They chewed into sacks, nibbled at heels, and sometimes crept into bedding for warmth. Fleas and lice were omnipresent. Servants rarely had the means to fully rid themselves of infestations. Blankets crawled, straw pallets itched. Sleep was broken by scratching and slapping in the dark. There were tricks rubbing vinegar into hair, sleeping with mint under the blanket, burning rushes, but they were temporary. The next night brought new visitors. In such conditions, sleep was less rest and more retreat, a fragile pause between tasks. Memory of the day. As a servant settled into their sleeping corner, perhaps sore from hours of lifting, or bruised from a careless shove, they replayed the day. Had they spilled the milk? Had the bread risen poorly? Had the Baron noticed the missing bowl? Every act had consequences. Every failure could mean lost wages or a punishment worse. But there were good moments too. A stolen laugh with the cook, a pat on the shoulder from the steward, a crust of cheese shared behind the scullery. These were the memories they wrapped around themselves, like a second blanket, brief comfort in a world where the stone never softened. The illusion of stillness. To an outsider, the servant quarters seemed still at night, but in truth, the castle's engine never stopped turning. One set of hands rested while another stirred. One fire died while another was lit. Someone was always awake, a baker starting the dough, a maid mending a hem, a stable boy checking the foal. The lower quarters weren't asleep. They were simply rotating, always moving, always cold. And as a servant drew a ragged wool blanket tighter and turned away from the fire's last glow, one question lingered. Was the castle ever truly alive without them, or did it only appear to breathe because they moved beneath its ribs, unseen, every night? Morning light, thin, gray, and cold, seeps into the lowest reaches of the keep. It does not arrive gently. It creeps under doors and around hinges, not to wake the sleeping servants, but to remind them they must already be awake. The noble family above stirs slowly, luxuriously, behind thick draperies and near fatting embers. But below, in the heart of the kitchen and scullery, the day is already in full motion. Hands are blistered before the sun fully breaks the horizon. We follow the servants from sleep into labor, revealing the laborious rituals of morning warmth, the rules they lived by, and the limits of their humanity within the cold machinery of castle life. Waking before dawn. No bells, no roosters for the servants. They rose by habit and necessity. Some were shaken awake by stewards or older boys. Others learned to sense the movements of the castle when the crows stirred on the tower, when the oven's smoke thinned, when the shutters clattered above. The first to rise were the scullery maids and bakers. They moved in darkness, whispering to one another, hurrying to light fires, grind grain, heat water. Their breath rose in clouds. Their feet slipped on frozen straw. There was no starting the day. The day had already started without them. Lighting the hearths, a daily battle. The hearth was both temple and trap. Keeping it burning was an art and an order. Firewood was precious, not because it was rare, but because hauling it was brutal. Splinters lodged in fingers, the bark left welts, and the cold numbed their grip. Every stick mattered. Nothing was wasted. The process was tedious. Ash was swept, embers stirred, kindling laid with trembling hands. Wet wood hissed, dry wood popped. The smoke was ever present, stinging eyes and lungs. Lighting a fire was not heroic, but it was essential, and if you failed, there would be no bread, and that meant punishment. The cold bread and the colder floor. Kitchens had stone floors, and even with a roaring hearth, they retained cold like a miser hoards coins. Feet ached within worn leather shoes. Knees stiffened. The floor stole warmth faster than any cloak could offer it. Flour dust rose into the air. Yeast was awakened. Porridge boiled, sometimes overcooked in haste. Water was drawn from deep, icy wells. In the cold months, food froze in the larder. Meat stiffened. Butter turned to stone. Every task took longer. Every tool was cold to the touch. Still, breakfast for the household was expected on time. Nobility did not wait, and they did not eat cold bread. Work while they sleep. The nobles above slept longer in winter. Servants envied this but also resented it. While the baron rolled into second sleep, servants were halfway through their chores. They scrubbed boots, cleaned chamber pots, and poured warmed wine into heavy goblets. They checked the frost on the inside walls and fetched extra blankets for those who asked. No task was too small to be demanded. A wrinkled tunic, a twisted candle, a slow dog, these were seen as faults of the servant, not of fate or weather. Mistakes could mean beatings, docked pay, or cold silence. Washing without warmth. Laundry was the cruelest of all chores in winter. Water froze before garments could soak. Hands turned purple in icy basins. Women used blunt rods to beat cloth into submission. Soap, if available, was harsh and made of animal fats. It clung to the skin like glue. Laundresses often worked outdoors, beside wells or near the edge of the bailey. Wind cut through their wet sleeves. Icicles formed on lines before garments could dry. And yet nobles expected clean linens. Bedclothes must smell of herbs. Tunics must be free of ash or sweat. No one asked what price was paid for such cleanliness. Repairs in the cold. Tanners, cobblers, and smiths had their own battles with the cold. Leather stiffened overnight and cracked under strain. Metal tools grew brittle. Saddles warped. Harnesses snapped. Still, repairs were expected. The baron's boots could not wait, nor could the stable doors, the pulley ropes, or the winch gears used to draw water and goods. The blacksmith's forge was one of the few places that offered true heat, but the labor came at a cost: burns, blisters, and soot that coated the lungs. Warmth in this world was paid for in pain. Orders, shouts, and silence. Communication in the servant class was more often shouted than spoken. Instructions barked across stone corridors. Names called down stairwells. Blame laid with pointed fingers. But among themselves, servants learned silence. They spoke in glances, gestures, brief murmurs, not just to avoid punishment but because energy was scarce. Words spent were warmth lost. There was laughter, yes, but it was fleeting, a shared joke over spoiled milk, a quiet giggle as a noble slipped on rushes. Moments of joy existed, but they came in stolen fragments. The hierarchy below. Even among servants, status mattered. The steward held authority over all. The cook ruled her kitchen with an iron ladle. The laundress with seniority could scold the younger ones. Those closest to the noble family, personal attendants, cupbearers, chambermaids, held greater trust and often warmer sleeping spots. Their loyalty was currency. Their access to the baron was a kind of power. And yet one misstep could return them to the bottom. One missing comb. One harsh word overheard. The hierarchy was as fragile as it was unforgiving. Illness and injury. There was no rest for the injured. A sprained wrist meant slower work, not no work. A cough was ignored until it turned bloody. Servants feared illness not just for the pain, but for the consequences. Sick workers were often sent away or left in cold corners to recover alone. A few were tended by herbalists or monks, but many simply faded from memory. The castle could not stop for one servant, and so the injured worked through pain, wrapped limbs in cloth, and whispered prayers through gritted teeth. Survival was not just about avoiding disease, it was about hiding it. Punishment in the night. The cold wasn't just a threat from nature, it was sometimes a tool of discipline. Servants who disobeyed might be denied blankets, locked in unheated storage rooms, made to stand outside at night. Cold was a punishment that left no bruises, only trembling silence. Some were made examples of. Their suffering was not hidden, it was displayed, a warning to others. Others simply disappeared, sent to harsher positions, or expelled into the night. The stone walls did not weep, and the noble halls did not notice. Fragile bonds. Despite this, bonds among servants grew strong. Suffering bred solidarity. They shared warmth, food, secrets. When one fell behind, another stepped in. They knew each other's stories, where their parents had worked, what illness plagued their sleep, which child might visit in spring. The baron's family rarely knew their names, but they knew each other, and that mattered. It was not friendship in the modern sense, but it was loyalty of a kind. The kind forged in frost, under low ceilings, with the constant ache of labor. And as the steward shouted a new list of tasks, and the castle doors groaned open to let in the bitter wind, a thought remained. Was this life beneath the floor a burden, or was it the true foundation on which every stone above quietly stood? The day has long passed its noisy middle. The great hall has been swept, the bread trenchers emptied, and the noble children tucked into lessons or play. Outside, the wind grows sharp again, biting at corners of the castle as shadows lengthen toward evening. And once again, the unseen hands begin their slow retreat. Below the noble floors, beneath the tapestries and guarded walls, the servants prepare for another long night. The rhythm is familiar, even sacred. There are no horns to call it, no bells to mark it, but it is known. Tonight's sleep, like all the others, will be broken, cold, and unfinished, but it will happen anyway, because it must. Now we conclude this story not with drama, but with the enduring silence of those who kept the world turning from beneath it. Cleaning the invisible. As the upper levels wind down into dim torchlight and slow footsteps, the lower quarters return to motion. The great hall is swept, bones and crusts are gathered for the dogs, rushes are replaced, ashes raked from the hearth. The chamber pots, heavy and foul, are quietly hauled away. No one thanks them. They are not supposed to be seen. Their success lies in invisibility. If the floors are clean, the rooms warm, the linens fresh, no one notices. But if a single corner is left dusty, if one candle sputters, then the reprimands come swiftly. The final fires. Each servant knows the routine of banking the fire. It's a sacred task. The hearth must not die entirely, just sleep, smothered under ash, waiting to breathe again by morning. The kitchen fire is prepared most carefully. It must last. It must hold warmth like a promise. The night crew watches it with reverence. Sometimes one sits near it long after others sleep, not for duty, but for comfort. The flicker of flame offers more than heat, it offers memory. The fire is the only voice that never scolds. Return to the straw. The sleeping places remain unchanged. A corner beneath the scullery table, a space beside the flour barrels, a shelf in the cellar flat enough to curl upon. No one has privacy. No one owns a bed. You sleep where there's space and silence. Some nest together, not always for affection but for warmth. Others find solitude, curling against the stone, trusting their own breath to carry them through. They undress only slightly. Belts loosened, shoes removed if the floor's dry, cloaks wrapped tight, blankets if they have one pulled up over their heads like hoods. It is a ritual as sacred as prayer. Dreams in the lower quarters. Servants dream differently than their masters. They do not dream of thrones or of battles won. They dream of meat, of baths, of shoes without holes, of soft hay and warm hands, of parents long gone, of letters they cannot read, of fields before they came to the castle, of silence without fear. They dream of fire that never goes out, of blankets that don't itch, of sleep without interruption. And sometimes they dream of being seen. Night shifts and standing duty. Sleep is not guaranteed. Some must stay awake. A scullery maid might be assigned to watch the fire. A boy might be sent to the parapet with a torch to alert the gate if visitors come late. A girl might sit beside a sick noble child, dabbing a fevered brow. These are the most thankless tasks. There are no warm seats, no extra blankets, just the long hours and the wind. Those on duty often walk small circles, stamping their feet to stay warm. They mutter songs under their breath. They count. Some cry. But by morning they must smile again. Death in the night. Sometimes one of them does not wake. It may be age, it may be illness, it may be that the cold finally clutched too tight. There are no grand funerals for servants. The body is carried to the chapel or buried outside the wall. A priest may murmur words, or not. It depends on the mood of the Lord and the day of the week. Another takes their place. The straw is not wasted. The shift continues. But their absence is felt quietly. The empty spot by the hearth, the missing laugh, the undone chore. Someone weeps, but not loudly, not long. Records and names. Most servants were never recorded. Their names didn't make it into the castle ledger unless they committed a crime or did something extraordinary. Historians can find references. The cook's boy, the chambermaid of Lady Anne, A washerwoman drowned, but no ages, no stories. They are ghosts in the margins, foundations without inscription. And yet the castle would not stand without them. What they knew. Servants knew more than their masters believed. They overheard, they observed, they remembered. They knew who was truly in charge, who whispered to whom, which child was sick, which noble was cruel, which corner rats hid in, which stones were loose. Knowledge was a kind of heat. It kept them sharp. It reminded them that they were more than shadows. Sometimes they used that knowledge, quietly, carefully, a misplaced document, a whispered warning, a recipe shared in secret, a door locked before harm could enter. The nobility believed they ruled the night, but it was the servants who truly knew its shape. Legacy in silence. The lower quarters left no monuments, but they left impressions. They shaped every inch of castle life. Their labor smoothed the stones. Their breath warmed the bread. Their sorrow soaked into the rushes. Their endurance was their legacy. The fact that they continued cold, aching, unseen meant the world continued with them. They were not saints, not always kind, but they survived, and that in the medieval night was nothing short of remarkable. Final reflection. As we close this story, return once more to the dark corners of the keep. Listen. You may hear nothing, but that silence is filled with meaning. A girl stirring coals with bare hands, a boy shifting in straw, a woman scratching dried blood from a tunic by moonlight. This is the rhythm beneath the stone, the heartbeat of history rarely told. And as another day of noble glory approaches, one cannot help but wonder. In the cold shadow of greatness, were the truest acts of resilience not found in war, but in the small, shivering hands that quietly kept the fire alive. Story 3. The Night Watchman's Rounds, Packing Through Stone and Shadow. The castle is sleeping now. High above, behind thick curtains and fatting embers, the noble family has drifted into slumber. Below, in the kitchens and storerooms, the last of the servants curl into corners, pulling wool over their heads. The wind outside brushes against battlements like a thief testing the locks. All seems still. But not everyone sleeps. For in every fortress, manor, and walled estate, there was always one who walked while others rested, the night watchman. His steps were the quiet metronome of survival, not just for his own safety, but for all those within the cold walls he protected. This is his world, a world of echoing boots, distant stars, and the weight of quiet responsibility. It is not a glamorous post, but it is one without which the castle would be blind and vulnerable in its darkest hours. Who was the night watchman? Unlike the soldiers posted on battlements or the noble guards of the Great Hall, the night watchman was a quiet, often solitary figure. Sometimes a retired soldier, sometimes a trusted servant too old or too injured for the field. His job, to walk, to listen, to notice. He did not carry a banner. He rarely carried a sword, a stout club perhaps, or a horn to sound alarm. His greatest weapons were his ears and his memory. He knew the castle better than most. Every turn in the stairwell, every creaking board, every breath of draft through the arrow slits. His watch was not just over the people, but the stone itself. Preparing for the watch. The shift began at dusk. Before setting out, he visited the steward. Names of guests, warnings of unlocked doors, knowledge of brewing trouble among the servants, all were passed to him. No written logs, just quiet murmurs by torchlight. He ate a humble supper, often alone. Bread, onion, maybe a strip of dried pork. Then he layered his clothes, a thick tunic, a padded wool cloak, leather boots stuffed with straw, a cap tied beneath his chin, gloves if he owned them with the fingertips cut for grip. His lantern, a small iron cage with horn window panes, was lit from the hearth. Inside, a tallow candle sputtered. It would smoke and stink, but last through part of the shift. Then he opened the heavy oak door and stepped into the darkness. The rhythm of the rounds. The castle was his map, and the night his test. He followed a path of his own creation. The gatehouse first, then the outer walls back through the bailey, past the stables, into the storerooms, and finally to the chapel door. He checked every lock, every window, every stairwell. His steps were steady, slow, deliberate, a pause here, a glance there. Nothing was ever left to chance. He walked the same route twice, then reversed it, so no one could guess when he might appear. Even the rats, it seemed, learned to avoid his lamp. The castle at night. At night the castle transformed. The echo of his boots sounded louder than ever. Water dripped in places that were dry by day. Wood creaked in rhythms that made no sense. Shadows stretched longer than they should. Doors swelled in their frames from the cold. Hinges moaned. Rushes rustled in unseen breezes. He passed through rooms that looked unfamiliar by lamplight. Familiar objects took on strange forms. A fur cloak hanging from a peg looked, for a moment, like a lurking man. A fallen stool became a crouched animal. But he did not flinch. He had walked these stones too many nights to be fooled. The cold, a constant companion. More than darkness, it was the cold that kept him alert. There were no warm chambers for the watchman. His rounds carried him through icy halls and open courtyards. Wind cut through the walls and found every gap in his layers. His fingers ached, his toes numbed. The tallow in his lantern grew sluggish. Sometimes, when the cold was worst, he paused near the kitchen chimney, pressing his hands to the wall for borrowed warmth. Once, he stood beneath the guardrobe chute just to feel the lingering heat of the Lord's bathwater. You learned to be resourceful, or you didn't last. Listening in the dark. Sound was his ally and his enemy. A dropped pot in the scullery, a door shutting where no one should be, a cough from a locked room, a whisper beneath the floorboards. He listened with the care of a monk in prayer. But he also knew the castle's false alarms, the wind in the arrow slits, the settling of stone, the hiss of an extinguishing candle. Even rats had their own predictable patterns. Distinguishing the ordinary from the unusual was his craft. He didn't just hear noises, he interpreted them. Keys and trust. He carried keys on a leather strap across his chest. Not all the keys, just enough to enter the places he was trusted to guard. Too many keys would be a danger. If he were killed or bribed, the castle could fall from within. He knew how to check a lock without opening it, how to test a latch without waking a room. If something was amiss, a loose bolt, a shifted latch, he marked it in chalk. He would return later in silence to see if it changed. Encounters in the night. There were other watchers in the castle. A steward rising to relieve himself, a servant tending to the fire, a page returning from an errand. They passed in silence, acknowledging each other with a nod. Words were rarely exchanged. But sometimes he encountered things stranger still. Once a nobleman drunk with grief wandered the halls, muttering to a portrait. Another time a stray dog found its way inside the gate. And often there were sightings whispered about figures in white, sounds of crying, glimpses of ghosts. He did not speak of these, not because he didn't believe, but because it was not his place to say. Dangers from without. Though the castle seemed secure, dangers always lurked. A loose shutter might signal an intruder, a footprint in the snow, the absence of a sentry at their post. Bandits rarely attacked by night, but spies and saboteurs sometimes did. And worse, during times of plague or famine, desperate peasants might attempt to breach the walls for food. The watchman could not fend off armies, but he could raise the alarm. And so he walked, always alert, the horn at his side silent but ready. Repeating the route. Each night passed the same, yet no two were alike. Some were uneventful, filled only with the creak of doors and the hiss of wind. Others held small dramas, a broken window, a missing tool, a suspicious noise. He never wrote these things down. He carried them in memory, and in the morning he reported only what mattered. Too much noise would dilute his voice, so he stayed quiet until quiet was no longer safe. And as his steps echoed once more down a spiral stair and the flame in his lantern danced low, you might wonder, was the castle truly at rest, or did it only pretend to sleep, relying on one silent figure to pace the night and hold its breath for morning? The hours between midnight and dawn are unlike any others. Time stretches, then collapses. Sounds grow louder. Shadows deepen. Fatigue sets in like frost creeping across glass, slow, persistent, and absolute. For the night watchman, these hours are not just long, they are the true test of vigilance. His is not the noble task of battle or courtly defense. It is the unheralded work of presence, of stillness in motion, of watching for what should not be in a world that pretends to sleep. In this second section, we walk deeper into the watchman's night, through the toll of exhaustion, the rituals of focus, and the moments when darkness becomes more than just the absence of light. The longest hour. By now the fire in the Lord's chamber has faded. The hall is silent. The dogs have stopped shifting on their chains. Even the rats are still for a moment. This is the hardest time to remain alert. The mind wanders, the limbs stiffen, the lantern burns lower, the temptation to sit just briefly grows stronger. But the watchman knows better. He keeps moving, always moving. Stopping means letting the cold win, letting the thoughts get too loud, letting mistakes creep in. And mistakes made in the dark are often only discovered at dawn when it's too late to fix them. Cold in the bones. No matter how many layers he wears, the cold always finds him. Through the seams of his boots, down the collar of his tunic, in the cracks of his gloves. Stone walls do not warm. They retain the night and offer no apology. The watchman stamps his feet, rolls his shoulders, rubs his hands until they ache. He counts to 100, recites verses, hums under his breath, anything to distract the body from retreating into itself. Warmth is not a state, it is a battle, one he wages quietly every night. Fatigue and the mind's games. Sleep deprivation is not just physical, it plays tricks on the senses. The watchman has seen curtains ripple with no wind, heard footsteps behind him that vanish when he turns, felt a presence just beyond his lamplight that dissolves when approached. He's learned not to react. The mind, he knows, will try to fill the silence, and not always with truth. So he focuses on the real, the groan of timber, the hiss of a dying candle, the faint breath of smoke from the hearth. These are facts. The rest he lets pass like ghosts. Faith as a fire. The night watchman, like many in his time, turns to prayer, not loudly, not formally, but as a rhythm like his footsteps. He recites a psalm under his breath, counts the beads of his rosary in his pocket, traces a cross on the cold door of the chapel. He is not a monk, not a priest, but he walks a cloistered path of his own, one paved in frost and silence. Some nights he prays for protection, others for strength, but mostly he prays for the sun. Passing through sacred places. His rounds bring him to the chapel. Inside it is darker than the halls. Stone angels gaze from shadows. The altar is bare, the candles cold. He does not linger, but he looks. He knows the stories carved in stained glass, the saints who never slept, the martyrs who kept watch in prisons colder than his own. He takes comfort in the idea that someone else somewhere once stayed awake in a darker hour. He does not kneel, not tonight. His knees are stiff, but he bows his head. Then he moves on. Locks and the language of security. The castle speaks in locks, a bolt drawn too far, a latch unhooked, a door too wide. The watchman knows the language. He checks each with practiced fingers. He notices when a door opens too smoothly, perhaps oiled recently, or when dust has shifted near a threshold, or when snow outside shows footprints with no return path. He does not shout or alert without cause, but he remembers. and he returns. A good watchman does not just walk, he watches. Unseen conversations. Sometimes he hears things. Servants murmuring behind the scullery wall, a lover sneaking from the stairwell, a steward muttering curses over unpaid rents, a visiting noble talking in sleep secrets meant for no one. He files it away, says nothing. His power lies in what he doesn't say. Every castle has ears, and he is the left ear, the one no one notices, the one that hears what the right ear ignores. When something is wrong, not every night is quiet. Sometimes he finds an unlocked gate, or a drunk servant sprawled near the stables. Once, he found a fire not yet banked, smoldering under dry rushes. His responses are measured. He wakes a steward if needed, reprimands the boy, stomps out the embers. But he moves like a shadow, never angered, never rushed. Panic has no place in his role. The castle must believe that the night is calm, even when it is. The mask of invisibility. Ironically, if he does his job well, no one notices. The baron rises to a quiet castle and assumes all is well. The steward prepares accounts, unaware of the fire that almost caught the wool stores. The servants find the pantry locked, never knowing the latch had been tested. No one thanks the night. But if he falters, if the fire spreads, or the door is breached, then everyone looks to him. His reward is silence, his punishment noise. It is a strange calling. The weight of loneliness. He is alone, utterly, profoundly. Even when he passes others, they are not company. His work isolates him. He knows things no one else does. He sees things no one else wants to. He ages faster than others, walks hunched before his time, develops aches in his joints that never leave. His sleep, when it comes, is never restful. And yet he returns every night, because the castle must be watched, because someone must pace between stone and shadow, keeping the flame lit. And as he rounds the final turn before dawn and touches the cold iron of the portcullis, one must ask, is he guarding the castle from the night, or is he guarding the night from the castle? The sky is beginning to lighten now, not with warmth, only with a faint promise of morning. The moon has dipped low behind the western trees, and the eastern horizon shows a bruised edge of pale blue. The castle still slumbers, but life has begun to stir at its edges. A kitchen girl yawns as she stokes the oven. A servant stumbles into the courtyard to draw water from a freezing well. A cock crows, uncertainly, from behind the stables. And the night watchman, silent, hooded, moving with worn grace, makes his final round. This is the end of the watch, the final turn of the key, the moment when vigilance fades back into obscurity and the world forgets again that it was ever watched at all. The final hour. The last stretch is often the most dangerous. Not because of intruders or unrest, but because the body begins to believe the work is done. The mind relaxes too soon. The cold that was once resisted now sinks deeper. The watchman resists the temptation to shorten his route. He checks every corner, every lock, just as he did at dusk. Even though he knows the castle has slept soundly, even though his feet are numb and the candle in his lantern has burned low. He must finish the path. The night only ends when every shadow has been accounted for. The unspoken report. When the watch is done, he returns to the steward. He gives a quiet nod, perhaps a few words if something needs mention. There was frost on the storeroom latch. Stable gate needs a new hinge. The lad in the pantry saw him with a candle. No grand reports, no scrolls or logs. His memory is the ledger. If there was no trouble, he says nothing at all. The steward understands. In this world, silence is praise. Returning the keys. He unfastens the strap of iron keys and hands them back. One by one, the tokens of authority are removed. With each key, he sheds a bit of responsibility. By the time the last is placed on its hook, he is no longer the night watchman. He is just a man again, tired, cold, mostly forgotten. Restoring the body. There is no warm bath waiting, no breakfast laid out. He eats crusts left in the kitchen, perhaps dipped in warm broth if he's lucky. His hands are scrubbed of tallow soot, his cloak hung near the fire to dry, his boots pulled off with effort. Then he crawls into a small sleeping nook in the servants' quarters or a narrow space in the gatehouse, away from light, away from talk. There he sleeps deeply, without dreams, until dusk comes again. The rhythm that never ends. This cycle continues every night, year after year. Watchmen come and go, but the role does not change. Some age into it, others age because of it. It is not a job given to the most skilled, but to the most trusted. It requires no title, only patience, quiet endurance, the ability to see what others ignore. It is the backbone of security, unseen, unthanked, but always required. When the watch ends forever, eventually the body gives out, the knees fail, the hearing dulls, the mind becomes fogged by nights blurred together. When that day comes, the watchman is replaced, sometimes by a younger cousin, sometimes by a former soldier. He does not resist. He knows the role is larger than him. He steps aside, teaches the route, passes on the quiet warnings. And then he fades into the background, perhaps tending to tools, perhaps sweeping snow, perhaps simply sitting near the fire, eyes still sharp, though his legs have long since stopped packing. Legacy written in dust. There are no statues to the watchman, no songs, no lineage to record. But his legacy is everywhere. In the storeroom never breached, in the kitchen that never burned, in the sword that stayed sheathed because the gate was locked, in the noble child who slept undisturbed. He left no mark in stone, but countless in silence. He was never the hero of the story, but he kept the story safe until morning. Seeing without being seen. The watchman knew things others did not. Which guard drank too much, which door stuck in the cold, which window frame was rotting, which noble crept out at night. He saw the castle not in its grandeur, but in its vulnerability. His knowledge was never spoken aloud. It was passed quietly, through habit, through routine, through the way he paused at a certain step or touched a doorframe as if checking for its memory. And when he was gone, these details were forgotten until someone failed to remember them. Reflection in the still morning. As the castle bursts into life again, no one mentions the night. The nobles rise and stretch, trusting the world has remained unchanged. Servants carry trays, dogs bark, horses are saddled. The sun melts the last frost from the courtyard flagstones. The watchman, sleeping now, is absent from all of it. But for a time between dusk and dawn, he was everything. He was the eyes in the dark, the ears behind the door, the silent walker of halls, the steward of quiet, the guardian of sleep. Final reflection. And so the story ends, not with a clash of steel or a rise of banners, but with the soft sigh of someone who gave their life to walking in circles so others could lie still. We often celebrate the kings, the warriors, the builders of walls. But what of the man who kept those walls watched while no one looked? What of the soul who heard every creak and knew when it mattered? What of the watchman? And if no one saw him, no one thanked him, and no one remembered his name, did that make his service any less noble than those who ruled above? Story 4, Chill in the Chapel, How Monks Slept Through Vespers and Frost. The chapel is dark now. The candles have been snuffed out one by one, their faint smoke curling upward like the last breath of the day's devotion. Outside, the wind glides low across the cloisters, rattling shutters and sighing through the narrow archways. Within the abbey walls, the quiet is not empty, it is deliberate, chosen, held. You are now in the world of the medieval monastic night. not of courtly games or castle feasts, but of quiet rituals, frost-covered sandals, and the slow rhythm of devotion carved deep into stone. This is a story of monks not in their midday prayers or public chants, but in the coldest hours, when even holiness cannot quite keep the chill away. For theirs was a sleep shaped by sacred duty, discomfort, and the belief that to suffer through the night in silence was to step a little closer to heaven. The life inside the cloister. To understand how monks slept, we must first understand how they lived. The medieval monastery was a self-contained world, built on rules, silence, and repetition. Whether a grand Benedictine abbey or a modest priory, life inside was governed not by seasons or rulers, but by time and, more specifically, divine office. 8 times a day the monks gathered for prayer, each hour with its own name: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Some came in daylight, others fell deep in the night. Their days were full: prayer, study, labor, and more prayer. Their nights, fragmented, disciplined, and cold. The monastic dormitory. Most monks slept in communal dormitories, long stone rooms above the cloisters or beside the chapel. Privacy was discouraged. The individual ego was to be dissolved, even in rest. Their beds were simple wooden platforms or rough pallets. Some had straw mattresses. Others slept directly on boards. Pillows were rare and, when permitted, stuffed with straw or rags. A woolen blanket might be allowed, usually coarse, often patched. In colder climates, fur cloaks were repurposed as extra covers. Even in wealthier abbeys, luxury was viewed with suspicion. Comfort was not a reward. Discomfort was purification. Clothes were not shed. Unlike nobles or peasants, monks did not change into sleeping clothes. They slept in their habits, coarse wool robes, usually brown, black, or gray depending on the order. The hood might be pulled over the head, a rope cincture loosened, and sandals left by the bed. But otherwise they remained dressed as they had been all day. There was no indulgence in warmth, no roaring hearths in the dormitory. At best, a small brazier or wall-mounted torch lit the long hall. More often, they slept in near darkness, the only glow coming from the moon spilling through leaded windows. The cold was accepted, even welcomed. Woken by the bell. Sleep came early, often just after compline, the final prayer service of the evening, but it would not last long. Sometime between midnight and 2 a.m., the bell would ring. Matins, the longest and most solemn of the night offices. The sound was deliberate, not loud. A soft toll echoing across stone, its purpose not to startle but to call, and the monks rose without question. Sleep was not sacred, prayer was. Feet on cold floors. The first sensation upon waking was not light or sound but cold. The dormitory floor, often bare stone, leached warmth through their sandals. In winter, the air inside was cold enough to see one's breath. Blankets, if they had any, were stiff with frost. But there was no dawdling. Monks stood, bowed briefly, and made their way silently to the chapel. No speaking, no complaint. The body's needs were secondary. What mattered was obedience and the divine office. The walk to the chapel. The chapel was not far, sometimes just 1 floor below the dormitory. Still, the short walk was symbolic, a journey from rest to reverence, from body to soul. The silence was total, only the sound of soft footsteps, the rustle of wool, the clink of a swinging thurible if incense was used. There were no crowds, no music, just stone, breath, and darkness. As the monks entered, they bowed low, stepped into their assigned stalls, and began the ancient rhythm of chant. The midnight voice. The matin service could last hours, especially on feast days or during Lent. The chants were slow, measured, drawn from centuries-old psalms and readings. The chapel, though unheeded, echoed with the sound of many voices speaking as one, not for show, not for audience, only for God. No instruments, No harmonies, just the cold breath of devotion turned into song. Monks would shift occasionally, rubbing stiff fingers, but no one left. No one asked how much longer. This was the life they chose or were called to. And even in cold, even in exhaustion, they did not resist it. Return to the dormitory. After matins, and sometimes lauds, immediately after the monks returned to their beds. But it was not a triumphant return, not a reward. Just a brief resumption of sleep before prime at dawn. The silence continued. The cold had only deepened, and the straw mattresses, once warm, were now stiff and damp. Some monks lay down immediately. Others knelt briefly, whispering a final prayer. Some could fall asleep again within minutes. Others lay awake, bones aching, eyes open to the rafters. Stillness returned. But rest, that was a privilege, not a promise. Thoughts in the darkness. What did they think of, these men beneath wool blankets and stone arches? Some thought of their sins, of duties left unfinished, of psalms misread or passages forgotten. Others recalled their families, those they left behind, or those they lost. Some monks had once been knights. Others were widowers. A few had been forced into the life by poverty or politics. But many simply breathed slowly, grateful for the pause before the next bell. And if sleep came, it came without dreams, or at least without dreams that could be shared. And as the frost climbed the edges of the narrow windows, and the next toll of the bell hovered just hours away, one must wonder, did the monks find peace in this rhythm of broken sleep, or did they merely wrap devotion around discomfort until the two became indistinguishable? The moon has passed its apex. The sky outside the cloister is vast and black, broken only by stars and the faint shimmer of frost collecting on the flagstones. Inside, the monks have returned to their beds after matins. The silence is not so much an absence of sound as it is a presence itself, settled, deliberate, unyielding. But sleep in the monastery was never complete. It came in fragments. It came with permission. And always, always it came beneath the weight of the rule. In this section, we go deeper into the monastic night, into the lives shaped by obligation, repetition, and sacred austerity. These were not men seeking comfort. They were seeking order, and in doing so, found a kind of strength few today would envy. The rule of Saint Benedict, sleep as duty. Much of monastic life across medieval Europe was guided by the Regula Benedicti, the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century but practiced and expanded for generations. The rule prescribed how long monks could sleep, when they must rise, what they should eat, how they should behave, and how silence should be observed. In winter, the rule allowed for slightly more sleep out of mercy, not indulgence. But even in the coldest months, a monk might sleep no more than 5 or 6 hours in fragmented portions. Sleep was considered necessary, but it was never to become a pleasure. Pleasure, after all, was a step away from discipline. Between matins and prime. The hours between matins and prime were short, sometimes just 2 hours. This liminal period, neither fully night nor morning, was filled with quiet and personal prayer. Some monks returned to bed. Others knelt in their stalls or remained in the chapel. A few, driven by inner devotion or sleeplessness, paced the cloisters in slow meditation, whispering verses under their breath. Their steps stirred the cold air, their sandals making soft taps on the stone. They did not speak. They did not acknowledge one another, but they knew they were not alone. This shared silence created its own fellowship, one built not on conversation, but on constancy. The absence of fire. Monasteries were often vast and solid, built for endurance, not warmth. The chapel, refectory, dormitory, and cloister walkways were nearly always unheated. Fire was reserved for the kitchens or infirmary. A monk might go the entire winter without once feeling truly warm. Some monasteries permitted heated stones or bricks wrapped in cloth at night, but this was rare, and usually reserved for the old or infirm. Most endured the cold with resignation. It was part of the vow: poverty, chastity, obedience, and in a quiet way, suffering. Their breath froze in the air as they chanted. Their fingers stiffened around prayer books, yet they did not falter. To be warm was not the goal, to be faithful was. The sleeping hall and the sound of men breathing. Return to the dormitory was never noisy. The hall, long and narrow, was lined with wooden beds or pallets spaced just far enough to discourage idle conversation. Some monasteries separated monks with thin wooden screens, not for privacy, but to reduce distraction. A single candle might remain lit, or the glow of the sanctuary lamp below flickered faintly through the stairwell. But mostly, there was darkness. There were no snores, not loudly anyway. Coughs were muffled. Shifting was subtle. The greatest sound was breath, dozens of men inhaling and exhaling in near unison. It was not unlike a chant itself. Even in sleep, there was a kind of rhythm. Midnight discipline. Not all monks obeyed the rule with equal strength. Some fell asleep too quickly after matins. Others lingered in their blankets and missed prime. The abbey had ways of addressing this. Sometimes a penance was given a day of silence, or an extra chore. In stricter orders, a monk might be denied food or asked to kneel in the refectory during meals, eating last. The point was not punishment, it was correction. To fall from the schedule was to fall out of harmony with the whole. And harmony was everything. Washing and cleanliness. In the early morning cold before prime, some monks performed light ablutions. There were no baths. Water was drawn from the well, ice skimmed off with a knife and cupped into hands. Faces were washed, hands scrubbed, feet sometimes rinsed in winter but only briefly. The practice was as much spiritual as physical, a symbolic washing away of dreams, temptation, and the last traces of sloth. To be cold in this ritual was not an error, it was a form of focus. The morning meal, when permitted. After prime, if the rule allowed, came breakfast, often just bread and watered ale. In some orders, no meal was taken at all until later in the day. There were no fires in the refectory. Monks sat on wooden benches in silence, the cold settling into their joints. Each monk ate alone, but always within sight of the others. Heads were bowed. Food was chewed slowly, deliberately. If a reader was appointed, he stood at a lectern and read scripture or the lives of the saints aloud, while the others listened in silence. There was no chatter, no warmth, but there was unity. The cold of the scriptorium. Later in the morning, many monks moved to the scriptorium, a room where manuscripts were copied, illuminated, and preserved. In winter, this was a place of beauty and pain. Fingers cramped around quills, ink froze in its wells, parchment stiffened and cracked if not warmed carefully by breath. And yet they worked, line by line, word by word, creating masterpieces that would survive centuries. The act of writing was a prayer in motion, and the suffering it demanded made it purer in their eyes. Aging monks and cold bones. For older monks, winter nights were especially difficult. Arthritis, sciatica, and toothaches worsened in the cold, but few complained. Fewer still asked for exemption. Younger brothers sometimes helped the elders to the chapel or brought warm broth at dawn. It was a quiet kindness, offered without instruction. But even in illness, the rule prevailed. If a monk could no longer rise for matins, he was not punished, but his absence was noted. Prayers were offered on his behalf. Still, many chose to rise anyway, hobbling through the frost with a stick, bowing low before the altar, chanting in a voice made thin by age. They did not ask for comfort, they asked only to continue. And as the bell tolled for prime, and the chapel filled once again with robed figures shivering but resolute, a question emerges. Was it the cold that shaped their devotion, or had their devotion shaped the cold into something they could call sacred? The chapel walls have seen centuries. They hold the breath of countless chants, the warmth of 1,000 extinguished candles, and the footsteps of generations of men who gave their lives to silence. By the time the winter sun reaches its low zenith, the monks have already completed most of their daily prayers. Labor in the fields, scribes in the scriptorium, cleaners, cooks, and copyists all move about the cloisters like slow-turning gears in a timepiece older than memory. But as evening falls and the day's last light glances off the damp stone and begins to fade, the temperature drops again. Vespers approaches, followed by Compline, the final prayers of the day. The monks are preparing to sleep again. And just like the night before, they know their rest will be temporary, fleeting, interrupted, but still they go willingly, cloaked in habit and humility. This section, the conclusion of our fourth story, explores the finality that shaped monastic sleep, not only the recurring interruptions of sacred duty, but the eventual, inevitable sleep that would come for every monk. Compline, the final light. As twilight descends on the abbey, the monks gather once again in the chapel. Compline is quiet, introspective, the shortest of the canonical hours but never hurried. The prayers are whispered, the chants subdued. Monks make the sign of the cross over their lips and hearts. They ask for forgiveness, for rest, for the strength to resist temptation during the vulnerable hours of sleep. There is no incense, no grandeur, just the even murmur of voices shaped by the cold. This final act of the day closes the book of their waking life. What remains is the sleep of the obedient. Preparing for the chill. Before returning to the dormitory, some monks tend to the needs of the community, closing shutters, ensuring doors are latched, and checking that elderly brothers have blankets or warm broth. These small acts of service are done without praise, quiet mercy given by one cold hand to another. The heat from the kitchen has faded. The halls are colder than ever, yet no fires are lit in the dormitory. The walls themselves seem to creak with frost. And so, wrapped in nothing but habit and humility, the monks retreat again to their wooden beds. The second sleep. Though Compline ends the day, true rest only begins after midnight matins is complete. Until then, first sleep is light and easily broken. But after returning from matins and sometimes lauds, the second sleep takes hold. It is here that the body releases its stiffness. The mind loosens its grip. Dreams, if permitted, creep in like incense under a chapel door. No dreams of grandeur, no flights of fancy, only the repetition of psalms, the face of a parent, or the warmth of sunlight remembered from youth. Second sleep was a luxury, though none called it that. It was the deepest surrender a monk allowed himself. When a monk did not wake, inevitably, one of them would not rise at the toll of matins. A brother who failed to stir, failed to respond to the bell or the gentle touch of another. Death came quietly in the monastery, without protest, without witnesses, a final sleep beneath the same rough blanket that had covered him for decades. The dormitory was not disturbed. The others continued their prayers. Later, after prime or perhaps the midday office, the body would be lifted and washed by the community, shrouded in simple cloth, no fine robes, no jewelry, just a cross and the whisper of psalms. He would be buried in the abbey grounds, perhaps beneath the cloister walkway or behind the chapel. His bed would be swept, his robe passed on, his name remembered in prayer but not carved into marble. His life had been lived in quiet cycles, and so too was his death. What remained of them? Unlike kings or knights, monks left behind few possessions: a worn book, a wooden cross, a patch of wall where they sat each morning. Their handwriting in the margins of a psalter, their voice lingering in the memory of a chant. Their daily steps wore grooves into the stone floors of the cloister. Their breath filled the chapel long after they were gone. In this way, they became part of the abbey itself. The cold that once stiffened their joints became the air others would breathe. The silence they kept became the silence others would inherit. Sacred sleep as spiritual warfare. For medieval monks, sleep was not merely rest, it was a battleground. They believed the hours of night were when demons worked hardest. Temptation, lust, laziness, and despair all crept in through drowsiness. To resist sleep or to wake easily and rise for prayer was to defy evil. The very act of waking from warmth to cold was a spiritual practice, a test. To endure the frigid air, the cracked lips, the aching spine, and still whisper a psalm that was the victory. In a world without central heat or comfort, resilience became righteousness. A night like any other. And so the cycle continued. Compline first sleep, matins, lauds, second sleep, prime, and the rest of the day. One night bled into another. Seasons passed through small changes: the thickness of frost, the tightness of joints, the brightness of moonlight through stained glass. But the cold remained constant. It was a second rule, a second vow, a quiet companion. It reminded them of humility, of death, of devotion. It reminded them that they were dust. And still they rose, again and again, for decades. Reflection in the cloister walk. Some monks walked the cloister in early dawn just before terce, hood up, hands folded, feet echoing off the damp flagstones. The cold seeped through their sandals, their breath fogged the still air. But they didn't turn away. They looked into the chapel window, toward the flickering lamp near the altar. And perhaps they thought, this is what it means to endure. This is what it means to choose silence over comfort. To sleep lightly, rise often, and ask nothing in return. Final reflection. The medieval monastery was not a warm place. It was not a place of soft beds, thick cloaks, or roaring hearths. It was a place where silence rang louder than bells, where time was divided not by seasons, but by prayer, and where sleep was taken in pieces given, not taken like a small offering of obedience. And in that small, dark dormitory, lined with rough wool and cold breath, each monk whispered his way through a life of devotion, not to be remembered, not to be praised, but simply to remain faithful. And as each night passed, broken by bells and chant and frost, one wonders, was it the body that froze in those long hours of silence, or the self, melted into something greater than warmth? Story 5. Women's work after dark, herbal brews, bed warmers, and quiet prayers. The great hall has grown quiet. The shutters are latched. The fire is reduced to low embers. The Baron is asleep behind heavy curtains. The watchman is making his rounds, and the servants are buried in straw or slumped against barrels. But not everyone sleeps. In a narrow chamber near the kitchen, a woman stirs herbs into a steaming pot. In the dim light of an iron lamp, her fingers sort roots and dried blossoms by memory. In another room, a girl lifts a pan of glowing coals and slips it gently between blankets. An older woman whispers a prayer while she kneels beside a child with a fevered brow. This is women's work after dark. It is quiet, slow, often unnoticed, but it is ancient. And in the medieval world, where cold could kill and night was feared, it was often the hands of women that kept the household warm, safe, and breathing. In this first section, we uncover the domestic world of medieval women at night, not as noble ladies of romance, but as workers, healers, mothers, and caretakers who fought back the frost with knowledge, endurance, and devotion. The domestic sphere, not powerless, just private. Much of a medieval woman's life was lived within walls, not because she lacked importance, but because her power was expressed differently. Her world was the home, the hearth, the chambers. In noble houses, she managed food, clothing, children, and servants. In rural cottages, she tended fires, livestock, and family. And at night, when the rest of the household slipped into uneasy sleep, her work often began again. It was women who managed the cold, who softened its bite with bed warmers, thickened broth, soothed coughs, and whispered prayers over the ill. Her tools were not swords or scrolls, but linen, lard, herbs, and thyme. The herb wife in the evening brew. In nearly every village or manor, there was a woman young or old who knew the plants. She gathered during the day and dried by the firelight. At night, she sorted, mixed, and brewed. Her teas could ease fevers, calm stomachs, or help a crying child sleep. Her poultices soothed bruises or drew infection from wounds. Her knowledge was passed down, not written. Intuition met tradition. In noble homes, the lady of the manor might be trained in such arts, expected to manage the sick room and direct the steward in mixing balms. In peasant huts, it was the grandmother or mother who brewed by instinct and smell. At night, when the body was most vulnerable and heat most precious, a steaming cup of valerian or chamomile could mean the difference between rest and death. Bed warmers and fire watch. The fire was never allowed to go out, not entirely. While men slept, women watched over the hearth. A bed warmer, an iron pan with coals inside, was used to chase the chill from sheets. Carefully moved beneath the blankets and withdrawn quickly, it offered momentary comfort. If left too long, it could start a fire. Timing and experience mattered. In cottages, stones were heated in the hearth, wrapped in cloth, and placed at the foot of the bed. In the absence of stone or iron, even oven-baked bread loaves were used to lend warmth through the night. The fire was more than a convenience, it was life. Its glow guided late-night steps. Its warmth kept children from freezing. Its light drove away things that couldn't be named. And when everyone slept, it was women who made sure the flame still lived. Mending in the moonlight. Night was often the only time women could sew. By day they worked, tended, hauled, and fed. After sundown, when the house was finally still, they sat near the hearth with needle and thread. Clothes were mended, tears were patched, new garments begun. Wool was combed and spun, linen was stitched, shirts were turned inside out and strengthened at the seams. For noblewomen, embroidery was also an expected skill. They stitched coats of arms, altar cloths, or linen for the sick. But for most, it was survival. A hole in a tunic let in frost. A torn sock meant frozen toes. Their work was not praised, but it was felt every morning in warm feet and mended sleeves. Tending to children. A child's cough at night could become a crisis. Women, whether mothers or nurses, listened with sharp ears. They rose to warm broth, check foreheads, change linens, or administer herbal syrups made from honey, vinegar, or ground root. Swaddling was inspected, wet cloth replaced, prayers whispered. In noble houses, wet nurses might be called. In cottages, the mother herself did everything barefoot, exhausted, leaning over straw bedding in the half-light. Lullabies were passed down like recipes. Simple melodies, sung under breath, layered with centuries of worry and comfort. And once the child slept, the woman stayed awake just a bit longer, listening, watching. Quiet prayers by the fire. After the work was done, or paused, many women knelt. Prayer was a comfort. It required no priest, only whispered words, a folded hand, a rhythm of breath. They prayed for the sick, the cold, the absent, for husbands on the road, for sons at war, for daughters in labor. They prayed against miscarriage, against thieves, against winter that stayed too long. Some spoke Latin, learned from a priest or book. Others prayed in simple words, old, rural, sometimes half-pagan. The line between prayer and charm blurred in the dark. What mattered was belief. Listening to the night. Women knew the sounds of the household better than anyone. The creak of the stair, the bark of the dog, the shift of roof timbers under frost. A good wife or maid could tell when the fire needed feeding just by the silence of the hearth. She heard mice in the grain, rain on the thatch, the uneven breathing of her husband or mistress. She was a sentinel, less praised than the guard at the gate, but often more effective. Her ear was attuned to life, to change, to danger wrapped in small noises. The work no one spoke of. There were labors that had no name, a daughter soaking laundry at midnight, a midwife sitting beside a dying mother, knowing she could save only one, a kitchen maid rubbing frostbite with goose fat, too afraid to tell the steward. These were not grand events, but they repeated every night in every village, in every keep. They were acts of resilience, of unseen, unwitnessed labor, and they kept the fabric of medieval life from unraveling in the dark. And as a woman wipes her hands on an apron, sets the last pot to simmer, and turns back toward the fire that still glows, we might ask, was it magic or memory that taught her how to warm a home when the world outside had frozen? The household is asleep mostly, but in one corner of the manor kitchen, a pot still simmers low over glowing coals. In the servants' quarters, a woman quietly rises from her mat, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders to check on a child's breathing. In a cottage beyond the manor fields, a midwife walks barefoot across frost-covered ground, summoned by a sharp knock on the door. Across the medieval landscape, night does not truly belong to sleep. Not for women, not for those who knew how fragile warmth could be, how fast an illness could spread, or how quickly silence could become sorrow. This section reveals the deeper rhythms of nighttime work, the heavier burdens, the unspoken traumas, and the quiet endurance of women who faced birth, blood, loss, and duty in the hours when others dreamed. The midwife's lantern. Few figures were more essential in the medieval night than the midwife. She was not always a healer in the formal sense, rarely trained by doctors, rarely literate, but she carried generations of knowledge in her hands. When labor struck in the late hours, as it often did, she came in haste. A small satchel of herbs, a clean knife, linen rags boiled earlier that day, a candle or lantern to guide her work. She entered homes like a shadow, speaking little, seeing much. Her touch was practiced, her decisions immediate. She worked in silence between screams and prayers, her own breath visible in the icy air. Birth by the hearth. Most children were born at home on pallets or straw beds near the fire. Labor could last hours, sometimes days, and often it came in the deep of night. Other women attended, a mother, a sister, a friend. The husband was rarely present. The midwife oversaw the scene. She rubbed backs, whispered encouragement, offered broth or herb-steeped wine. She cut the cord, cleaned the child, pressed herbs against torn flesh. If all went well, she swaddled the infant and passed it into its mother's shaking arms. If not, she stayed long after the fire went out, tending to grief before she washed her hands. Death in the dark. Not all nights ended with a cry. Childbirth was dangerous, cold made it worse. Blood loss, infection, stillbirth, all were common. When a child was born silent, or a mother died soon after, it was women who prepared the body. There was no fanfare, no ceremony, just boiled cloths, whispered prayers, a wooden box or linen shroud. Sometimes the midwife buried the child herself, especially if the priest refused to perform the rite for an unbaptized soul. It was a grief carried quietly, stored deep, rarely spoken of in the morning. But it never left. The night apothecary. Beyond childbirth, there were other crises that called women from sleep. A fever that rose too quickly, a burn from the hearth, a man returned from hunting with a twisted leg, a child struck by a winter chill and wheezing through the dark. Women knew what to reach for: dried coltsfoot for coughing, willow bark for pain, marigold poultices for wounds. The home had its own apothecary, hidden in baskets, wrapped in cloth, stored in earthen jars. The warmth of a good herbwife's remedy could mean the difference between sleep and sickness, between recovery and burial. These medicines were rarely praised, yet widely relied upon. Weaving, spinning, waiting. In many homes, spinning continued long after sundown. Wool was carded by firelight, distaff tucked beneath the arm, spindle whirring softly between fingers. It was the sound of preparation for warmth, for income, for survival. Women spun while waiting, for suns to return, for stew to thicken, for the fire to burn low. Hands kept moving when hearts were uncertain. Thread became a form of prayer, a way to focus, a way to hope. Even noblewomen spun by duty if not necessity. Embroidered cloth was a symbol of virtue, but also of skill. To be idle, even at night, was frowned upon. Watching the dying. Sometimes women sat vigil. Not for prayer or pageantry, but simply to stay, to keep a hand in another's, to wipe a brow, to soften the silence of death. A dying father, a sick child, a neighbor slipping away from plague or cold or despair. Men did not keep these watches, not often. It was the wives, mothers, widows, and sisters who stayed beside the dying through long, frozen hours. Sometimes they hummed, sometimes they cried, often they said nothing at all. Just waited, watched. And when the breath finally stopped, they closed the eyes and covered the face. The secrets women kept. Night held many secrets, and women kept most of them. Whispers passed over steaming pots, quiet confessions between sisters, an herbal tonic brewed for reasons unspoken, a pregnancy hidden, a bruise explained as clumsiness. The night did not judge, but it remembered. Women learned to say little, observe much, and store their wisdom behind the press of their lips. They knew which child was not truly the nobleman, which servant was leaving food out for a sick lover, which mistress feared her own bed. They didn't write letters or carve names into stone, but they carried truth, quietly, constantly. Knowledge passed by firelight. Formal education was rare for women, but knowledge came anyway. Recipes, remedies, superstitions, traditions, rites, lullabies, warnings. Everything was taught by example, passed from grandmother to daughter, not as lessons but as nightly rituals. How to stir porridge to avoid scorching, how to bind a sprain with ash and cloth, how to tell when the cold would last beyond the morning, how to bury a child with gentleness. These weren't lessons in books. They were carved into hands, repeated through repetition. And they always came out most clearly after dark. And as the fire crackles low, and a woman rinses her hands in cold water before returning to bed, we might ask, was it their silence that kept them invisible, or was it their endurance, night after night, that quietly shaped the very heart of survival? The household is still, but it is not empty. In every corner, beneath blankets, behind doors, beyond the fire's glow, there lingers the quiet presence of care. A kettle blackened with years of use rests on a trivet beside the hearth. A spindle hangs from a beam, its wool wound neatly. A basket of herbs, dried and curled, sits beneath a shelf. These are not tools of war or state. They are the instruments of survival. And though many who used them are long gone, their work continues. In this final section, we reflect on the legacy of women's labor in the medieval night, not as a relic of hardship, but as the enduring thread that wove warmth into a world of stone and silence. Their strength was not in visibility. It was in repetition, memory, and care. The cycle repeats. Each night followed a rhythm, not always by the clock but by necessity. A fire was stirred, a child soothed, a cough treated, a stitch sewn. The same tasks over and over, the same concerns, the same burdens. And yet no two nights were ever truly the same. One night brought a birth, another a death. A sudden frost meant a shift in duties. A spilled broth required a new batch. A neighbor's knock brought a different kind of prayer. Repetition was the structure. Flexibility was the mastery. It was the women who adapted without instruction, who held the pattern together in shifting winds. Memory lived in warmth. Most of what women did at night left no record, no name, no witness. But it left warmth. In a child's dry cough turning to breath, in the steady burn of a hearth that did not die, in the warmth of the bed where coals had been drawn across the sheets, in the comfort of waking to find oneself still alive in a winter that killed. Their labor became memory, not in monuments but in sensations, and sometimes even in stories. When stories were told, women were the first storytellers. As children stirred restlessly beside the hearth, it was the mother, grandmother, or sister who told them tales of saints and spirits, of wolves and winters, of brave girls and clever wives. These weren't just entertainments, they were instructions, survival lessons wrapped in fable. How to recognize a storm in the wind, how to keep bread from spoiling, how to tell a true promise from a false one. And though many of these stories were never written, they survived because they were told again at night by other hands in other winters. The stitches that lasted. Textiles woven, spun, stitched were the physical legacy of women's hands. Blankets passed from mother to daughter. Linen shirts outlived their owners. Baby clothes were repurposed, altered, handed down. In noble homes, samplers and embroidery adorned chapel cloths and family banners. In peasant homes, a patch on a cloak held memories too. Sometimes long after the maker was gone, her stitch remained. A pattern on a sleeve, a color choice, a frayed edge repaired again and again. And in each thread a presence. She was still here, still protecting, still warming. The lady of the manor and the women she oversaw. In a castle or manor house, the noblewoman bore responsibilities that echoed those of peasant women on a different scale, but not of a different nature. She managed the female servants, ensured food was prepared, coordinated with the steward, and cared for the sick. In times of crisis, plague, famine, siege, it was often the lady who organized the rationing, nursing, and prayer. And at night she too kept vigil, for her children, for her household, for her husband if he was at war or sick in bed. Her letters, when preserved, speak of illness, births, kitchen accidents, failed pregnancies, wet nurses, and God. Her power was rooted in attention, and she wielded it quietly, even through the coldest nights. Witch or wise woman? In some places, a woman's nighttime herbal work was considered sacred, in others suspicious. The line between healer and heretic was thin. A poultice that saved one child might be blamed for the death of another. And yet women did not stop. They kept brewing, binding, anointing, sometimes in secret, often in faith. Their power was drawn not from rebellion, but from responsibility. They were not sorcerers, they were stewards. And when they were gone, even those who once doubted missed the warmth they had left behind. The faith that wrapped around the night. Women's prayers were different than monks' chants or priests' sermons. They were born of necessity, personal, improvised. They knelt by beds, by hearths, over sick children or bread dough. They prayed in Latin, French, English, or whispered tongue. They crossed themselves while drawing water or plucking herbs. For a husband on the road, for a harvest, for forgiveness, for the strength to survive another night without answers. And when sleep finally came, if it came, they clutched their rosaries or their shawls. They dreamed of saints, of spring, of nothing. Their prayers did not echo in chapels, but they lasted. Those who were lost. Some women never had time to pass on their knowledge, lost to childbirth, illness, hunger, or punishment. Their hands were stilled before their daughters learned the tinctures. Their stories were buried with them. But their absence was felt. In the uneven stitches, in the silence of bedtime, in the cough that lingered longer than it should have. Others remembered them, lit candles, kept their recipes in clay jars, whispered their names in moments of danger. And in this way, they remained part of the lineage, even if no one else recorded them. Final bedtime lessons. If you look carefully through old manuscripts, household guides, herbals, devotional books, you'll sometimes find faint notations in the margins. A suggestion to add garlic, a reminder to wrap wool tighter, a small amen next to a childbirth prayer. These were not the notes of scribes. They were of wives, mothers, maids. Proof that even in the world of parchment and ink, women made their mark, quietly, confidently. Between lines, between hours. Final reflection. The medieval night was long, the winters colder still, and yet the world kept turning thanks in no small part to women who worked while others rested. They did not rule, they rarely wrote, they were not remembered in songs. But they remembered everything. And in every warm bed, every recovered child, every morning that began with breath and fire, there was the echo of their hands. So we ask once more, was it history that forgot them, or did they simply pass their strength forward, thread by thread, into us? Story 6. Castle kitchens never sleep. Embers, bread, and sleepless labor. You stand in the heart of a stone castle, not in the Lord's hall where banners hang, nor in the chapel where prayers echo. You are below in the kitchens. The air is warm here, even as frost grips the outer walls. But it is not a comforting warmth. It is heavy, greasy, earned. Here the fire never dies. The ovens are always lit, and someone is always awake. While nobles sleep and guards walk the ramparts, the castle kitchen churns through the night, baking bread, turning meat, boiling broth, and preparing the morning's meal before the day has even begun. This is not a place of rest. It is a place of labor, noise, sweat, and constant motion. In this first section, we descend into the world of medieval castle kitchens at night, into the routine chaos, the low-ranking workers who never slept enough, and the glowing heart that kept the entire household alive. The hearth that never cools. The kitchen hearth was the largest and hottest fire in the castle, built into thick stone walls and stoked constantly. Not only for cooking, but to provide boiling water for cleaning, warmth for rising dough, and heat for drying herbs, linens, and sometimes clothes. It could never be allowed to go out, not even once. Fire was difficult to start, precious to maintain, and dangerous to mishandle. A hearth that died in the night meant cold food, angry lords, and a day that began in shame. So a firekeeper or scullion, usually a young boy or old woman, was tasked with watching the coals through the darkness. They dozed sometimes, but only lightly. One bad night, one misstir of the ashes, and the whole kitchen would be punished. Bread begins before dawn. Bread was the most vital food in the medieval world, and making it started long before sunrise. Bakers worked in the dead of night, grinding flour, mixing dough, and shaping loaves by lamplight. The air was thick with dust and sweat. Water was hauled by hand. Heat stung the eyes. Backs ached from kneading. In smaller castles, only a few loaves were made. In larger households, dozens of servants turned out hundreds of them. Coarse brown loaves for the servants, finer white bread for the nobility. Each class received their share, unequal in quality, but equal in necessity. The oven was lit at midnight. The bread was expected before breakfast. There was no room for failure. The spit boys in the slow roast. In preparation for morning meals or leftovers to be served, cold meat was often roasted overnight. Turning the spit was among the most grueling and thankless jobs in the kitchen. A spit boy, typically a child or low-ranked servant, sat near the fire, slowly turning heavy rods of pork, beef, or fowl over the flames. He was burned on one side, chilled on the other. If he turned too slowly, the meat scorched. Too fast, it undercooked. If he nodded off, the fire caught the fat and sent sparks flying. Some castles used simple gears or weights to turn the spit, but most relied on tired hands and blistered palms. The meat would be carved by others. He would not taste it. Smoke, salt, and the scullery. The kitchen was not a single room. It was a system, a labyrinth of smokehouses, pantries, sculleries, and bake rooms. At night, workers preserved meats with salt. They hung herbs to dry. They stirred pots of slowly thickening broth and skimmed fat into jars. They sharpened knives and soaked beans. The scullery was the worst of it. Here, in cold water and near darkness, pots were scraped, bones boiled for stock, and scraps sorted for animal feed or reuse. It stank of fish, grease, damp wood, blood. The scullions' hands were raw, their eyes red, their stomachs often empty. And still they worked, because the kitchen never stopped. Pests, plague, and precautions. Rats were constant companions, so were flies. Cats were kept in the kitchens not as pets but as staff. Their job was to hunt, not cuddle. Food had to be stored high or tightly sealed. Barrels of flour were checked for worms. Spices, expensive and rare, were kept locked away. The kitchen was a place of abundance and therefore a place of danger. If food was spoiled or tainted, it could sicken the entire household. Night workers knew this. They sniffed, tested, discarded, not because they were respected, but because they had to be better than the mistakes they couldn't afford to make. Water and wood, the heavy lifting. Every pot needed water, every fire needed wood. Both had to be fetched in the night. Buckets were carried from wells or nearby streams, often in bitter cold. Slippery ground, splinters, spilled loads, all common. Wood was hauled from covered stores, chopped, sorted, stacked. These were not dramatic tasks, but they were ceaseless. A missed bucket meant no boiling. A poor stack of logs meant a sputtering fire, and both would be punished by angry cooks or impatient stewards. Kitchen workers were not seen by the lords, but they were blamed when things went wrong. And so they labored quietly under stars and torchlight. Light in the dark. Kitchens used more fire than most parts of the castle, but still needed candles and lamps. Tallow candles were cheap and foul-smelling. They smoked, hissed, and sometimes attracted insects. Wax candles were reserved for nobility or chapels. A single kitchen might have a dozen flickering sources of light, each dangerous, each necessary. Oil lamps were hung from beams or mounted to walls. Flames danced, shadows shifted. In some kitchens, the low light made it difficult to judge color or texture. Mistakes happened. Cuts bled in the dark. But no one paused to complain. The food had to be ready. Memory and instinct. There were no cookbooks in most kitchens. Recipes were oral, passed down from mistress to maid, from cook to assistant. Measurements were done by hand, a pinch, a handful, a ladle full. The workers knew the difference between barley porridge and peas pudding by smell. They could tell when a stew was done without tasting it. They knew how long a roast took by watching how the fat dripped. And they remembered who liked what, how the lord preferred his morning meat, how the baroness took her spiced wine, how the visiting knight refused garlic. The kitchen at night was as much memory as movement. And as the sky just begins to pale and trays are laid out, fires replenished and bread arranged in baskets, you might ask, was the castle fed by noble gold or by the calloused hands of those who labored unseen through every sleepless night? The sun has barely touched the eastern sky, but the kitchen has already been alive for hours. The morning meal will soon be served in the great hall. Trays must be hot, loaves must be sliced, bowls filled. All must be clean, all must be right. But the castle kitchen, while unacknowledged by those it feeds, is not a disordered chaos. It is an engine, tightly wound by hierarchy, tradition, and necessity. Orders are followed without question. Mistakes are punished. And beneath the clatter and steam, a web of unspoken rules determines who stands near the hearth and who cleans the floor. In this section, we explore the inner structure of the medieval kitchen and the lives of those who served within it. Cooks, spit boys, pot women, butter churners, larders, and luggers. Together, they fed the castle and bore its heat in silence. The cook is queen or king. The head cook, often a woman in earlier medieval centuries and a man in later ones, held authority over the entire kitchen. not noble by title, but noble by necessity. She if in a noble house might have served since youth, having climbed from scullery maid to assistant to cook. He if in a monastery or later manner had learned from the kitchens of larger estates or the service of royal households. The cook knew the tastes of every person in the castle. She managed stocks, directed hands, rationed spice, and determined the flow of labor. Her word was law in the kitchen. Even the steward deferred sometimes to her expertise. And she slept rarely. The chain of command. Below the cook came an organized, if informal, hierarchy. Undercooks handled main dishes. Bakers and brewers managed their own rhythms. Roast turners minded the spits. Larderers oversaw cold storage and salted meat. Pantry maids watched over dry goods. Scullions cleaned endlessly. Each role had subranks. Younger workers learned by observing, mimicking, and surviving. You proved yourself with cuts and burns. You advanced through stamina, not ambition. Each task had its time. Meats began before midnight. Broths boiled for hours. Bread was set before cockcrow. Greens were picked at dawn. Custards were poured just before serving. To miss your window was to upset the whole cycle. No one wanted that. Specialization in a sweltering system. The kitchen might seem chaotic to the outsider, but it was ruthlessly segmented. One person might do nothing but skim broth. Another churn butter for the ladies' breakfast. Another was trusted only with salt storage. A fourth worked only the grain mill. Division kept things efficient and prevented theft. Spices, for example, were too valuable to entrust to anyone casually. Saffron, cinnamon, cloves, and pepper were kept in locked boxes, measured under watchful eyes, and added only at the final moment. Even eggs, milk, and honey were rationed with care. Luxury was portioned precisely. The poor didn't taste it. Theft and temptation. The kitchen was tempting and risky. A dropped fig, a spare cut of cheese, a half-eaten heel of nobleman's bread. To eat without permission was theft. To pocket spice, ruinous. Punishments ranged from docking wages to dismissal or public humiliation. Still, hunger did not care, nor did exhaustion. Scullions scraped crusts into their mouths when no one looked. Boys licked grease from carving knives. Girls sipped the milk meant for mourning. Most cooks turned a blind eye within limits, but every kitchen had a tale of the one who took too much. And what became of them? The scullery, bottom of the ladder. The worst work fell to the scullions. They were the youngest, the weakest, or the newest. Their hands were raw, their backs bent, their tasks endless. Washing pans as large as cartwheels, scraping rotted meat from barrels, cleaning flagstones slick with fat, emptying waste buckets into the trench. They rarely saw the hall, never touched the food served to nobles. Their reward was survival. And sleep, if it came, was curled beneath a table, wrapped in a damp apron, beside the ashes of a long-dead fire. The sound of suppressed suffering. The kitchen was noisy, but not with laughter. Voices barked orders, knives clanged, fires snapped, doors slammed. But beneath it all, a layer of silence. The silence of sore joints, of burnt fingers, of cold shoes and aching teeth. Workers did not complain. There was no time, no place. If someone limped, they were told to walk faster. If someone wept, they did so near the washroom. The cook had no patience. The food had no mercy. And yet, despite all this, no one left, because there were mouths to feed, both above and below. Feeding the household, feeding the self. Most kitchen workers did not eat what they made. They had separate meals, coarser bread, thinner soup, stew with bones but no meat, and they ate only after others had finished. Still, it was a point of pride when the meal succeeded, when the Baroness praised the pottage, when the Lord complimented the roast, when no scraps returned to the kitchen. and if a bit of leftover broth remained, thick with flavor, it was ladled out slowly, quietly, as if it were a secret. For a moment, even the lowest in the kitchen tasted victory. Apprenticeship by observation. Learning to cook in a castle kitchen wasn't taught, it was absorbed. No books, no lessons, just watching. The angle of a knife, the sound of a boiling pot, the pinch of salt added at the right time. A new girl would be ignored, corrected, and finally accepted. Mistakes were scolded but often forgiven, because everyone had burned the bread once, everyone had added too much vinegar, everyone had dropped something expensive. Survival in the kitchen meant humility and memory, and maybe, one day, passing that knowledge on. And as the morning meal is served and plates clatter back into the scullery, one wonders, was this a place of punishment or a hidden empire where strength was measured not in titles, but in the ability to keep feeding a world that never thanked you? By the third day of a feast, the castle's great hall was thick with heat, spice, and the echo of laughter. Trays were lifted high, jugs of ale poured endlessly. Birds, beasts, and sweetened fruits arrived in careful procession. Nobles toasted, musicians played. And below them, out of sight, the kitchen boiled with exhaustion. This final section traces the farthest extremes of the castle kitchen, the manic whirl of banquets, the starvation of famine years, and the strange resilience of those who cooked in silence, through celebration and collapse. It is the story of survival by firelight, of entire estates depending on unseen hands, and the legacy left by those whose names were never carved into stone, but whose work was tasted in every bite. Banquets and the breaking point. Feasts were announced with fanfare and planned weeks in advance, but for kitchen workers, they meant terror. Meat was butchered in staggering quantities: geese, deer, swan, and wild boar, fish hauled in, pastries begun days before, sweets crafted with sugar too precious to touch otherwise. Dozens of servants rose long before dawn and worked past midnight. No one sat, no one paused. Burns were ignored, blisters bandaged quickly, knives never stopped moving, the air filled with smoke and shouted orders. This was the kitchen at its most spectacular and most brutal. By the end of the third day, everyone was near collapse. And yet they began again. The cold Lenten kitchen. Just as suddenly, there were seasons when meat was forbidden: Lent, Advent, Vigil days. Then the kitchen shifted. Out went the beef, the pork, the butter. In came eels, herrings, salt fish, peas, almonds, and oats. Yet nothing became easier. Fish spoiled quickly, especially in inland castles. Almond milk had to be ground by hand. Pea porridge needed hours, and if rules were bent, if lard was slipped in or broth reheated, it could spark scandal. Kitchens adapted. Lent was not a rest. It was a change of pace, one just as demanding, only in different ways. The cook's power was tested most during these sacred stretches. Feeding and famine. Some years, the kitchen was not a place of labor, it was a place of fear. Crops failed, storms ruined grain, war disrupted trade, prices soared, and the larder stood half empty. In those years, the cook faced the impossible: to feed a household on scraps. Coarse bread stretched with beans or bark, watery soup thickened with roots, salted meats shaved thin, every bone boiled twice. Servants grumbled, nobles complained, the fire still burned. And behind it, someone still stirred the pot, hoping it wouldn't run dry before morning. Waste, reuse, and the genius of scraps. Waste was rare, not out of virtue but necessity. Bones became broth, fat was rendered for candles, stale bread was fried or crushed, peels fed pigs, brine was reused. The castle kitchen operated like an ecosystem. Nothing was lost. Leftover meat, pie filling, cold porridge fried, wilted greens cooked into stew. Even ashes from the fire had you scattered over icy steps or added to soap mixtures. The genius of the kitchen wasn't just in its feasts, it was in its frugality. in the silent calculation of every scrap. The constant cost of fuel. Wood was life, and every pot, every oven, every fire demanded more. Servants carted wood in shifts, chopped, stacked, fed into hearths. A 3-day feast could consume enough timber to strip nearby groves. Even in quiet seasons, the kitchen burned through cords of firewood. If supplies ran low, meals were shortened, ovens cooled, and tension rose. A good cook wasn't just a chef. She was a fire master, a fuel economist. And when heat failed, she found ways to fake it curing, drying, covering. Because cold food was shame, and shame was not permitted. Who tasted, who served, who was seen. Rarely did kitchen workers enter the great hall. The food was passed up through stairwells or service doors. Pages and hall boys carried it. Nobles dined. Praise might trickle down. More often, only criticism did. Sometimes a cook was summoned to answer questions or worse, to be scolded. But her work was mostly invisible. The only way to be noticed was to fail. And yet her dishes, her spice blends, her carving skills, her seasonings became memories at the table. The guests might not know her name, but they remembered the meal. Even if they never said thank you. Apprentices and the legacy of taste. Some kitchens kept apprentices a younger child, sometimes a relative, learning the art. They learned not just recipes but rhythm, when to stir, when to slice, how long to knead, how much salt to add. These apprentices, often illiterate, carried the flavor of their kitchens into new households. When they left for marriage or moved to another manor, they brought the taste of one castle to another. In this way, medieval cuisine was not national but local, a patchwork of palates shaped by cooks no one recorded, but whose tongue shaped a region's flavor for generations. Final reflection. The kitchens of medieval castles never slept. They labored through hunger and harvest, through war and wedding, through Lent and feast and famine. They bore the heat, the grease, the splinters, the scalds. They worked with dignity but without recognition. They did not write their names in chronicles, but they wrote flavor into history. And when the castle fell silent, when the halls emptied and the hearths cooled, it was the last smoke of the kitchen fire that rose through the roof. The final mark of a world that lived, breathed, and fed itself one sleepless night at a time. So ask yourself, did the castle rule because of its towers and titles, or because, every morning, someone in the kitchen made sure there was bread on the table?